Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to have you here for another quiet inquiry. Tell me, is there an old letter or folded paper resting near you tonight, its ink long since dried? Watson believed even the smallest crease, the faintest seal, could guard a truth worth keeping. Do subscribe so no margin goes unread. Now, draw a little nearer, for as Holmes knew, nothing committed to paper truly escapes an observant eye. Find us always on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, linked below. Chapter 1. The Gentleman from Russell Square. It was upon a raw evening in November, when London lay smothered beneath a fog of that peculiar yellow-grey hue, which our city alone seems able to produce, that I found Sherlock Holmes engaged in a study so curious that I confess I stood some minutes upon the threshold before he acknowledged my presence. He was seated at the deal table by the window, a lens in one hand, and before him lay spread upon a black velvet cloth a dozen or more discs of wax, each bearing the impression of some official or heraldic seal. "Come in, Watson, and close the door smartly," said he, without lifting his eyes from his work. "The fog is bad enough without our inviting it to share the fire." I did as he bade me, and settled into my accustomed chair, watching him for a time in silence. It was a habit of mine, developed over years of our association, to allow Holmes his silences, for I had learned that they were rarely idle. At length he set down his lens with a small sigh of satisfaction. "Seals, Watson," said he, "are among the most honest of human inventions, and also among the most easily betrayed. A man may lie with his tongue, forge a signature with practice, but a seal impressed in soft wax carries within it the very fingerprint of the die that made it. Flaws, chips, the wear of years, all faithfully recorded. I have been comparing the seal of the probate registry as it appeared in 1889 with its present form. There is a hairline crack in the lower scroll that was not there 5 years ago. An idle amusement, I ventured. An investment, he corrected, against the day when someone imagines that an old seal, cleverly reproduced, will pass for a new one." He had scarcely finished speaking when we heard the bell below, followed by the murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice, and a lighter, more agitated one in reply, and a moment later there came a rapid step upon the stair. Our visitor, when Mrs. Hudson had shown him in, proved to be a small, precise gentleman of perhaps 45, dressed with the sober correctness of his profession, though his collar was slightly wilted, and his hands, I observed, were not quite steady. He introduced himself as Mr. Edmund Fairley, solicitor of Russell Square, and begged our pardon for the lateness of the hour with a nervous rapidity that told its own tale before ever he came to his business. "Pray sit down, Mr. Fairley," said Holmes, "and compose yourself, for I perceive that something has occurred within the last few hours to disturb what is ordinarily a most orderly mind. A solicitor of your evident carefulness does not arrive at a stranger's rooms after dark without his hat brushed, unless the matter presses hard upon him." Fairley started, glanced at his hat as though it had betrayed him, and sat. "Mr. Holmes, I am undone," said he. "I represent the estate of the late Sir Alister Vane, who died a fortnight since, a widower without issue of his own, possessed of considerable property, several houses in London, railway shares, and a collection of antiquities that alone must be worth some thousands of pounds. Sir Alister left no valid will. The probate court, after due inquiry, granted letters of administration authorising his nephew, Mr. Charles Vane, to manage the estate as his nearest surviving kin." "A common enough situation," said Holmes, "though evidently not a simple one, or you should not be here. The grant itself, sir, the original document sealed by the court, has been stolen from my own chambers, from a locked room, within the space of a single afternoon, mere hours before it was to be presented at the bank to unfreeze the estate's accounts." Holmes's languid manner vanished upon the instant, and he leaned forward with that quickening of the eye which I had come to recognise as the surest sign of his interest. "Stolen, you say, from a locked room. Tell me the whole of it, and omit nothing, however trivial it may seem to you. I have found that the criminal classes have a great respect for the trivial. It is generally where they are careless. Fairly drew a steadying breath. My chambers are in Bedford Row. I keep a private records room, entered by a single door of which only I and my senior clerk hold keys. Within that room stands a steel dispatch cabinet, and within that cabinet, secured by a separate key which I keep always upon my own person, the grant was placed not 2 days ago. Yesterday afternoon my clerk, Thomas Wren, went to the cabinet upon an errand and found it empty. No sign of forcing upon either door or cabinet? None whatever. That is what makes the thing so monstrous. It is as though the paper had dissolved into air. And who, besides yourself and this Mr. Wren, had occasion to be in your chambers yesterday? Fairly counted them upon his fingers, with the meticulous air of a man accustomed to drawing up schedules. Mr. Charles Vane himself, who came in the early afternoon to dispute with me over an advance against the estate. He is, I fear, encumbered with gambling debts, and impatient of the delay in settling affairs. Miss Eleanor Vane, Sir Alister's niece, arrived shortly after him. She's convinced her cousin unfit to be trusted with the family fortune, and came to inform me she intended to contest the administration. Mr. Horace Bell, who served Sir Alister as private secretary for 20 years until his dismissal some months since, called to deliver an old account book of the late baronet's, and Mrs. Lydia Crowther, who was Sir Alister's companion and kept his house, brought round a packet of household papers I had requested. "A full afternoon," Holmes murmured. "And your clerk, this Mr. Wren, what manner of man is he?" "The most reliable creature imaginable, Mr. Holmes. 12 years in my service, never a day's absence, never a farthing astray in the accounts. It was he who discovered the loss, and who has been beside himself with distress ever since. He begged to be allowed to assist in the search, and has been of the greatest use to the police already. Ordinary, would you say? Painfully so." Fairley looked a little puzzled at the phrase, but nodded. "I suppose one might say so. A most unremarkable man, in every outward respect." Holmes rose and stood a moment before the fire, his hands clasped behind him. "Mr. Fairley, I will come to Bedford Row in the morning and examine your records room for myself. In the meantime, I will only observe that a document such as this is rarely stolen for what it is, a piece of sealed and stamped paper, but rather for what it permits its possessor to become, or to prevent another from becoming. Someone, somewhere, has calculated very carefully what the absence of that grant will cost, and to whom. Our business is to discover the sum and the name." Fairley took his leave somewhat comforted, though the fog swallowed him at the corner of the street, and I confess I watched the yellow gaslight upon the wet pavement for some time after the door had closed, wondering what manner of intricate deception now lay coiled somewhere in that respectable quarter of legal London, waiting for Holmes to draw it, thread by thread, into the light. Chapter 2. The Locked Cabinet. We reached Bedford Row a little before 10 the following morning, the fog of the previous night having thinned to a grey mist that clung about the chimney-pots and softened the outlines of that sober legal quarter. Fairley's chambers occupied the ground and first floors of a narrow brick house, respectable and unremarkable, with a brass plate so well polished that it seemed to apologise for the disorder now troubling its owner's affairs. We were admitted by a thin, stooping man of some 55 years, whose mild countenance and diffident manner marked him at once as Thomas Wren. He wore his years of service like a well-brushed coat, and there was in his eyes an anxious eagerness to please that I found, on the whole, rather touching. "You will be Mr. Holmes," said he, bowing slightly. "I have thought of nothing else since it happened, sir. If there is any particular you wish explained, I am entirely at your disposal." "You are very good," said Holmes, and I could not tell, from his tone, whether he intended the words as simple courtesy or something more. "Let us begin with the room itself." Wren led us down a short passage to a heavy door of stained oak, which he unlocked with a key drawn from his waistcoat pocket. Within was a chamber, perhaps 12 feet square, lined with shelves of deed boxes and lit by a single high window, its glass frosted for privacy. In the centre stood the steel dispatch cabinet, black japanned and solid, its door now standing open upon an interior lined with green baize and quite empty of the document we sought. Holmes examined the door of the room first, running his fingers along the jamb and studying the lock with his glass. No scratches, no marks of a pick, no indication that this door has been forced, he said, half to himself. The mechanism is old but sound. Mr. Fairley, you say only yourself and Wren hold keys to this door? That is so, said Fairley, who had joined us, and the cabinet key is separate again, kept always in the second drawer of my own desk in the outer office. Never carried upon your person. Only when the cabinet is to be opened, it is returned to the drawer immediately after. Holmes turned his attention to the cabinet lock itself, and I saw him stiffen slightly as he bent his glass upon it. Bring me better light, Watson, if you would be so good as to hold the window curtain aside. I did so, and by the improved illumination Holmes traced with the tip of a pencil, never touching the metal, a thin dark line within the keyhole's rim. A streak of graphite, said he, and quite fresh. Now that is a curious thing to find in the lock of a cabinet that has been opened, by your own account, only with its proper key. Fairley professed himself entirely unable to account for it, and Holmes did not press the point, but turned instead to a survey of the floor, going down upon one knee with a readiness that never failed to astonish visitors unfamiliar with his methods. Near the foot of the cabinet he paused over a small crescent-shaped smear, dull red against the dark boards. Sealing wax, he pronounced, touching it lightly and examining his fingertip. Broken and ground into the floor, as though a stick of it had been dropped and trodden upon. He straightened, and his eye fell next upon the corner of the Turkish carpet nearest the door, which bore, I now observed, a faint dark stain, roughly circular, some inches across. This is damper than its surroundings, and yet Mr. Fairley tells me the day was dry until the evening rain. A spilled cup of tea, perhaps, or something brought in from without. I am sure I cannot say, Fairley murmured, plainly bewildered that such trifles should command so much attention. We passed next into the outer office, a comfortable room of desks and deed boxes where Fairley conducted his ordinary business. Here Holmes's eye lit upon a brass paper knife lying beside the inkstand, its blade pointing toward the window, while every other object upon the desk, blotter, seal press, a small brass clock, faced squarely toward the chair. This knife has been moved, said he, and replaced carelessly or in haste by someone unfamiliar with the desk's ordinary arrangement, or too distracted to trouble over it. Wren dusts that desk each morning, said Fairley. He would know its arrangement better than I. Just so, said Holmes, and glanced toward the clerk who had followed us in silence, his hands folded before him, watching each discovery with an expression of mild, helpful concern that never once, so far as I could see, gave way to alarm. It was at this juncture that a heavy tread upon the stair announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, who greeted Holmes with the mixture of respect and wounded pride that had become, over the years, a settled feature of their acquaintance. "So you're here before me, Mr. Holmes, as usual," said he, shaking the mist from his hat. "Well, I'll save you some trouble. I know who's behind this, and it isn't graphite or sealing wax or any of your microscopic fancies. It's Charles Vane, plain as daylight. The man's up to his ears in debt, and without that grant the estate stays frozen, which suits him admirably, for it gives him time to make private terms with his creditors before the money's out of his hands and into the court's scrutiny. A motive, certainly," said Holmes, "though motive alone has hanged few men and cleared fewer still. Tell me, Lestrade, has Mr. Vane any particular skill with locks?" "None that I've heard," the inspector admitted, "but a man in his position can hire skill enough, if he has the mind to." Holmes said nothing further upon the subject, but before we took our leave he turned to Wren with a question so unexpected that I saw even that placid countenance flicker for an instant. "Tell me, Mr. Wren, is the office copying press still in use?" The clerk blinked. "The press, sir? Bless me, no. It has stood untouched in the back room these 5 years and more. We have no occasion for it now that the typewriting machine does all such work." "I see," said Holmes, and thanked him with every appearance of having received an answer of no particular consequence. Yet as we descended the stairs I observed him glance once, briefly, at his own shirt cuff, upon which, though I could discover nothing there myself, he seemed to find some small matter worthy of a moment's private reflection. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked when we had gained the street. "Ink, Watson," said he, "or rather the absence of it where one might reasonably expect to find it. But I will say no more until I have looked a little further into this very interesting household. We are dealing, unless I am much mistaken, with a mind that has taken considerable pains to appear ordinary." And with that he fell silent, and would speak no further upon the matter the whole length of our walk back toward Baker Street. Chapter 3. The Second Document. The morning following our visit to Bedford Row brought with it a development which none of us, I think, had anticipated, and which served only to deepen the shadows already gathering about that unhappy household. I had scarcely finished my breakfast when a message arrived from Fairley, so urgently worded that Holmes was upon his feet and calling for a cab before I had fully grasped its contents. We found the solicitor in a state bordering upon collapse, seated behind his desk with an envelope before him, as though it were a live coal he dared not touch a second time. "It came by the second post, Mr. Holmes," said he, addressed to me in typewritten characters and bearing no signature of any kind. He pushed it across the desk and Holmes drew out the contents, with the careful deliberation of a man handling something that might yet prove dangerous. Within was a single photographic print, somewhat reduced in size, but unmistakably a reproduction of the missing grant of administration. The court's heading, the formal language of appointment, the ornate seal, all rendered with a fidelity that struck me as little short of remarkable. Beneath it lay a slip of paper bearing a single typewritten line: "Withdraw Charles Vane from the administration, and the original shall be returned." "Blackmail, plain and simple," said Fairley, mopping his brow. "I have already sent word to Inspector Lestrade." He arrived within the half hour and read the note with the satisfaction of a man whose theory has been handsomely confirmed. "There, Mr. Holmes, what did I tell you? Somebody means to force Vane out, and I'd wager my pension it's young Miss Eleanor behind it, or someone acting for her." That lady herself arrived shortly afterward, summoned by Fairley, and the accusation was not long in reaching her ears, for Charles Vane had come with her, and lost no time in making the connection himself. "It is exactly the sort of scheme you would contrive, Eleanor," said he, his handsome face flushed with anger. "You have said openly more than once that you mean to see me set aside." "I have said I believe you unfit," she returned, with a composure that did not entirely conceal the hurt beneath it, "and I have said I would contest your appointment, openly, through Mr. Fairley, and through the courts, as any honest person would. I have never stooped to a threat scrawled upon a scrap of paper, nor would I know how to counterfeit a legal seal if my life depended upon it." Holmes had taken no part in this exchange, his attention wholly absorbed by the document itself, which he now examined beneath his lens with an intentness that gradually drew every eye in the room toward him. "The wording is precise," he murmured, "precise to a fault. Here, beside the signature, is reproduced even the small accidental blot which I noticed yesterday upon the original grant when Mr. Fairley showed me his file copies, a blot no forger would think to invent, for it serves no purpose but authenticity. Whoever made this copy had the original itself before the camera, not a description of it." "Then it confirms the theft was for exactly this purpose," said Lestrade, "to extract terms from the estate." "It confirms a great deal about the copy," Holmes replied, "and rather less, I think, about the purpose. Observe the envelope, if you please." He held it to the light. "The gum along the flap has been moistened unevenly, thickly at one corner, scarcely at all along the other. A small matter, but suggestive of haste, or of a hand not perfectly steady." He raised it to his nose and inhaled lightly. "And there is a faint odour clinging to the paper. Cloves, unless I am mistaken." "Cloves!" Fairly repeated. And then, as though struck by a sudden recollection, "Why, Bell. Horace Bell has suffered from toothache these 2 years past, and is never without a paper of cloves in his pocket. I have seen him chewing them 100 times. And the address," Holmes continued, setting the envelope down, "has been typed upon a machine of some age. Note the lowercase e. It sits a fraction above the line, the type bar evidently worn or bent." "Bell has an old machine," said Fairley eagerly. "He brought it with him when he left Sir Alister's service, having bought it originally for his own correspondence." Lestrade's countenance had brightened considerably during this recital, and he rubbed his hands together with the air of a man to whom the case had suddenly simplified itself beyond all difficulty. "Cloves, the old machine, and a grudge besides, if I'm not mistaken, dismissed after 20 years' service, and not a penny left him in the will, because there was no will at all. I think we need look no further, Mr. Holmes." "You may be entirely right," said Holmes, in a tone that somehow contrived to agree with the words while withholding all assent from their conclusion. "Tell me, does Mr. Bell chew his cloves whole, or crush them?" Fairley looked startled by the particularity of the question, but answered readily enough. "Whole, I believe. He keeps them loose in his waistcoat pocket." "I ask only from curiosity," said Holmes, though I, who knew him better than any man living, was aware that he asked from nothing of the kind. He returned to his study of the photograph, turning it this way and that beneath the light, and at length laid it down with an expression I had learned to associate with dissatisfaction rather than triumph. "It is a very complete case against Mr. Bell," said he at last. "The cloves, the typewriter, the motive of a faithful servant left destitute by his master's carelessness in the matter of a will, every piece fits its neighbour with a neatness that would satisfy a jury in an afternoon." "Then you agree with me," said Lestrade, not without a note of triumph. "I agree that the evidence has been assembled with very great care," Holmes replied. "It is upon that very completeness that I find myself dwelling, Inspector. In my experience, guilt is generally an untidy business. It leaves gaps, contradictions, small inconsistencies that betray the human hand behind it. Evidence which arrives already sorted, labelled, and tied with ribbon is evidence I have learned to unpack very carefully indeed, for I have more than once found that the ribbon was tied by someone other than the party it was meant to condemn." Lestrade's face fell somewhat at this, though he recovered himself with a shrug. "You may unpack it as you please, Mr. Holmes. I shall have a warrant for Bell within the day, unless you can show me better cause to hold my hand." "I will endeavour to find you one," said Holmes quietly, and gathering up his hat and stick he bowed to the company and led the way out into the grey Bedford Row afternoon, saying nothing further until we had gone some distance, when he remarked, as though continuing a conversation begun long before, "The trouble with a photograph, Watson, is that it can only copy what already exists. Someone had the original document in hand long enough to reproduce it in perfect detail. That narrows our field very considerably, whatever Cloves may have to say to the contrary." Chapter 4. A Visit to Vane House. Sir Alister Vane's town house stood upon a quiet square in Bloomsbury, one of those tall, sombre residences whose blinds seem always half drawn. Whether from mourning or from long habit of discretion I could not have said. Holmes had proposed the visit that same evening, remarking that a house so recently bereaved often preserved, for a little while at least, traces of its late master's mind that no amount of subsequent tidying could wholly erase. We were received by Mrs. Lydia Crowther, a tall woman of perhaps 50 years, dressed in unrelieved black, whose bearing had about it a dignity that seemed only partly natural and partly a kind of armour, carefully maintained. She led us through a hall crowded with the evidences of Sir Alister's collecting habit, Egyptian fragments, Grecian vases, a suit of Italian armour standing sentinel beside the stair, into a small morning room where a fire burned low. "I scarcely know what more I can tell you, Mr. Holmes," said she when we were seated. "I have already spoken with the police." "You have spoken with the police concerning the theft," said Holmes gently. "I wish to speak with you concerning Sir Alister himself, and how he passed the last months of his life. I understand he was much occupied toward the end with matters that had little to do with railway shares or antiquities. A shadow passed across her composed features. He had become preoccupied, yes. He asked me more than once to write to parish offices for copies of old registers, birth certificates, school records, correspondence going back 30 years and more concerning his brother's family. His brother being the father of Charles Vane. Richard Vane, yes, dead these 15 years. Sir Alister said very little to me of his purpose, only that he wished to be certain of something before he died, and that certainty, he said, mattered more to him than comfort. It was at this point that Horace Bell was announced, having called, he explained, to inquire after certain books of Sir Alister's that he believed himself entitled to as a memorial of his long service. He was a spare, grey man, with the stooped shoulders of one who has spent a lifetime bent over ledgers, and he greeted us with the wary courtesy of a man who knows himself under suspicion and resents it without daring to say so plainly. Holmes put to him the same question he had put to Mrs. Crowther, and Bell, after a moment's hesitation, answered with evident reluctance. Sir Alister had begun to question whether Mr. Charles was entitled to inherit at all, said he. I do not say I believed it myself, Mr. Holmes, but I will not deny what I was asked to do. In his last months he set me searching old records, parish registers principally, for evidence touching upon his brother's marriage and upon the birth of Mr. Charles. He never told me plainly what he suspected, and I did not ask. It was not my place. And yet the implication seems tolerably plain, Holmes observed. If Charles Vane's legitimacy could be successfully challenged, the administration of the estate would pass, I apprehend, to Miss Eleanor Vane as the nearest kinswoman of undoubted descent. Bell inclined his head without speaking, and I confess that even I, unversed as I am in the particulars of the law, could see how neatly this new fact settled itself into the case that Lestrade had already constructed against Charles Vane. Here at last was a motive graver than mere debt, the motive of a man protecting not his fortune only, but his very name and place in the world. Holmes, however, showed less interest in pursuing this line of thought aloud than in examining the room in which Sir Alister had evidently conducted his private inquiries. Mrs. Crowther led us, not without some visible reluctance, to a small study on the first floor, its walls lined with document boxes, its writing table bare save for a blotter and an empty inkstand. Here Holmes's attention fastened at once upon a low drawer set into the side of the table, whose lock bore about its keyhole a scattering of fine bright scratches, as though a key ill-suited to the mechanism had been worked in it with some impatience. This drawer has been opened by someone unfamiliar with its lock, said he, drawing it out. Within lay a bundle of letters, tied with faded tape, and numbered in a careful hand upon their outer folds, 1, 2, 3, and so onward. Yet when Holmes had laid them upon the table and counted them through, he looked up with the particular stillness that I had come to recognise as the outward sign of some inward discovery. Number 7 is missing, said he. The sequence runs from 1 to 12, yet 7 is absent, and the tape has been retied, not in its original knot, but in a plain bow such as any hurried hand might make. Mrs. Crowther professed entire ignorance of the matter, and I believed her sincere so far as it went, though there was in her manner still that same guarded quality I had marked before. Holmes turned next to the hearth, where the ashes of a small fire lay undisturbed, and drew from among them, with the delicate care of a man lifting a wounded bird, a fragment of photographic paper no larger than a shilling, badly charred at its edges but preserving upon its unburned corner the ghostly image of a young man's shoulder, clad in the stiff, high collar that had been the fashion of some 30 years before. Do you recognise this, Mrs. Crowther? She took it from him with visible reluctance, studied it for a long moment, and then said, in a voice that had lost something of its earlier steadiness, I have never seen it before, Mr. Holmes. Holmes didn't press her, though I saw his eyes rest upon her face a moment longer than courtesy strictly required, and he received the photograph back without comment when she returned it, wrapping it carefully in his handkerchief before bestowing it in his breast pocket. We took our leave shortly after, and walked some way through the darkened square in silence before Holmes spoke. "This household, Watson, is concealing not one secret, but several, and I am now tolerably persuaded that they are not the same secret wearing different faces. Mrs. Crowther's unease when confronted with that photograph is of an older, and I think more personal character than anything touching the missing Grant. Bell's reluctance to speak of Sir Alister's inquiries has the flavour of loyalty rather than guilt. And somewhere among all this lies buried the one secret that answers our actual question: who took the Grant and why, while the others serve chiefly to obscure it, as smoke obscures a fire without being, in itself, the fire." "Then you believe the stolen Grant and this old family matter are unconnected?" "I believe nothing so simple, my dear fellow," said he, drawing his collar up against the night air. "I believe rather that we have been shown a house full of doors, and that only one of them opens upon the room we seek. Our task now is to determine which." Chapter 5. The Clerk Who Remembered Everything. Holmes resolved upon the following day to interview each of the principal actors in this drama singly, having remarked at breakfast that a company examined together will invariably support one another's evasions out of a kind of social instinct, whereas the same persons questioned apart will often contradict, in some small particular, what they had agreed to leave unsaid. We began with Charles Varsin, whom we found at his lodgings in a state of considerable agitation, pacing before an unlit grate with the restless energy of a man whose nerves have been stretched beyond their ordinary compass. He admitted his debts with a frankness that did him some credit. "I owe upward of £800, Mr. Holmes, and I do not pretend otherwise," said he. "But I had already arranged terms with a private lender against my expectations from the estate, terms agreed before ever the Grant went missing. I had no need to steal it, and every reason to wish it safe, for its loss delays the very funds I require." A reasonable objection, Holmes conceded, though not, I fear, one that will satisfy Inspector Lestrade, who holds that desperate men do not always calculate their interests with perfect clarity. Eleanor Vane, whom we found next at her aunt's house in Kensington, met us with a composure that had, I thought, cost her some effort to maintain. She confirmed readily enough that she had consulted a barrister regarding a challenge to her cousin's appointment. "I intended to proceed as any honest person would, Mr. Holmes, through the courts and in the full light of day," said she. "I have never had occasion to conceal my opinion of Charles, nor would concealment serve me. For what value has a secret threat when an open one would answer as well, and leave my conscience clear besides?" Bell, when we called upon him a second time, proved more forthcoming than before, as though the shadow of arrest already hanging over him had loosened some restraint. He confessed with evident discomfort that he had copied a number of documents for Sir Alister in the last weeks of the baronet's life. "Old parish records chiefly," said he. "Touching Mr. Richard Vane's marriage and the birth of his son, I did as I was bid, Mr. Holmes, and asked no questions, for it was not my place to question a master I had served 20 years. Mrs. Crowther, when we returned once more to Bloomsbury, would say nothing further upon the subject of the burned photograph, meeting every approach with a silence so absolute that Holmes, after a few attempts, let the matter rest, remarking afterward that a locked door is sometimes best left untried until one has found the key. It was Thomas Wren, however, who occupied the greater part of that day's inquiry, and whose evidence, at first sight the most valuable we had yet obtained, gradually revealed itself to be the most curious. The clerk received us in Fairlie's outer office with his customary eagerness, and proceeded, at Holmes's request, to reconstruct the whole of that fateful afternoon with a precision that fairly took my breath away. He named the hour of each visitor's arrival to within a few minutes. He described the door by which each had entered, and the chair in which each had sat. He recalled that Charles Vane had worn his grey overcoat still buttoned, that Eleanor Vane had carried a small blue portfolio of papers, that Bell had set his account book upon the corner of the desk nearest the window, that Mrs. Crowther's packet had been tied with green string rather than the customary brown. "You have a memory, Mr. Wren, that any barrister might envy," said Holmes, and I detected beneath the compliment a note that Wren himself, absorbed in his own recital, did not appear to catch. "I have always had a good head for particulars, sir," said Wren modestly. 12 years in Mr. Fairley's service teaches a man to notice such things." "No doubt," said Holmes. "Then you will have no difficulty, I think, in giving me the same account once more, but in reverse order, beginning with the last visitor of the afternoon and working backward to the first." It was the smallest of pauses, no longer perhaps than the space of a single breath, but I saw it, and I saw Holmes see it also. Wren's eyes flickered, his hand rose a fraction toward his collar, and when he spoke again it was with a hesitation wholly absent from his first recitation, as though he now groped for facts rather than simply reporting them. Mrs. Crowther came last, sir, at perhaps 4:30, and before her Mr. Bell, and— Forgive me, Mr. Holmes, it is a strange thing to say, but a man's memory runs more easily in one direction than the other." "A very natural observation," said Holmes smoothly, and turned the conversation to other matters, though I could see that something in him had settled, quietly and finally, like a die falling upon its chosen face. That evening, back in our rooms at Baker Street, Holmes fell into one of those long silences during which he seemed almost to withdraw from the room entirely, his eyes fixed upon the middle distance, his pipe cold and forgotten in his hand. At length he roused himself and began, without preamble, to speak. "Consider the graphite in the cabinet lock, Watson. I demonstrated to you once, if you recall, in the affair of the Camberwell forgery, that a key rubbed lightly with soft graphite and worked into a lock will take upon its surface a faithful impression of the wards within, an impression from which a duplicate key may afterward be filed with very little difficulty. Someone did precisely this to Fairley's cabinet." "But surely that required the original key," I objected, "which Fairley says never left his desk drawer except when the cabinet was actually opened." "Just so," said Holmes, "and there lies the whole crux of the matter. Only a person with regular unremarked access to that desk, a person whose presence beside it would excite no comment whatever, at any hour of any day, could have borrowed that key long enough to take its impression and returned it before its absence was noted." He drew upon his pipe, found it cold, and set it aside. "I measured this afternoon, while you were occupied with Bell, the distance between the cabinet and the disused copying press in the back room, 11 paces, Watson, no more. I examined also the dust upon that press which had been disturbed, and recently, in a manner wholly inconsistent with 5 years' neglect." "You believe the press was used to reproduce the grant?" "I believe it is the only apparatus in that office capable of producing a copy bearing the particular characteristics I observed in the photograph sent to Fairley, though I shall say no more upon that head until I have confirmed it beyond dispute. For now, Watson, I will only observe that a memory too perfect is, in its way, as suspicious as a memory too poor, for the truth, which we come upon haphazardly and recall in fragments, rarely arranges itself into so smooth and biddable a narrative as the one we heard this afternoon. Chapter 6. Sir Alister's Last Inquiry. Holmes returned to Bloomsbury upon the third morning of our investigation with an evident determination to press Mrs. Crowther beyond the guarded reticence she had thus far maintained, and I confess that I accompanied him with some misgiving, for there had been in the lady's bearing a suffering too genuine to be lightly disturbed. We found her again in the small morning room, and Holmes, seating himself opposite her, spoke with a gentleness I had not always known him to employ toward reluctant witnesses. "Mrs. Crowther," said he, "I do not ask you to betray any confidence lightly given, but I must tell you plainly that a man stands presently in danger of arrest for a crime I do not believe he committed, and that the truth you are withholding may be the very thing that saves him. I ask you to consider that silence, however loyal in its intention, is not always the kindness it appears." For a long moment she said nothing, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and then, with something like the collapse of a long-held tension, she began to speak. I was a maid in the Vane household, Mr. Holmes, nearly 30 years ago, before ever I came to Sir Alister's service. Richard Vane, Mr. Charles's father, was a young man then, and secretly married, against his family's wishes, to a woman far beneath his station. The marriage was concealed from the world. She was never received, never acknowledged, and within a year or two she had vanished altogether from respectable society. I do not know what became of her. And Charles was the child of this marriage? So it was always believed, said she. And so Richard himself declared upon his deathbed, when Charles was but a boy of 10. But Sir Alister in these last months came to doubt it. He had found something, I do not know precisely what, that led him to question whether Charles was truly his brother's son at all. Holmes received this with no great surprise, and I understood that he had suspected as much since our discovery of the missing correspondence. But it was Bell, who had accompanied us that morning at Fairlie's suggestion, and who now sat somewhat apart by the window, who produced the detail that carried the matter forward. There is a memorandum, Mr. Holmes, in Sir Alister's own hand, which I copied for him not 6 weeks before his death, said he, drawing a folded paper from his breast pocket. I kept a copy against my own better judgment, feeling the matter too grave to trust entirely to another's keeping. It instructs an agent to search for a man named Arthur Wren, last known to be employed as a junior clerk in Richard Vane's household, some 30 years since. The name fell upon the room with an effect I can only describe as electric. I saw Holmes's eyes move, swift and silent toward the door, though Thomas Wren was not present to receive that glance. "Wren," I said, unable to contain myself. Surely nothing as yet," said Holmes, though the sharpness with which he took the memorandum from Bell's hand belied his caution. He studied it in silence for some minutes, then folded it away with the photograph he had already secured. "We will ask Mr. Wren himself what he knows of this name." We found the clerk at his desk in Bedford Row that same afternoon, and Holmes put the question to him without preamble, watching his face as a man watches the surface of still water for the first ripple of some creature moving beneath it. "Do you know of any relation named Arthur Wren, employed some 30 years ago by the Vane family?" "No relation of mine, Mr. Holmes," said Wren, and the answer came, I thought, with a rapidity that sat oddly against his usual measured manner. "Wren is not so uncommon a name." "I did not suggest it was uncommon," Holmes observed mildly, "only that this particular Arthur Wren was once a clerk, as you are, and vanished from the Vane household under circumstances that seem, upon inquiry, to touch rather closely upon the matter now before us. You will forgive me if I find your denial a fraction too prompt for a question that need have cost you no thought at all, had the name been genuinely strange to you." Wren's composure, so remarkable throughout our previous dealings with him, wavered visibly under this quiet pressure. He set down his pen, and for a moment I saw in his mild face something harder and more guarded than I had yet observed there. "He was my father, Mr. Holmes," said he at last, in a voice grown suddenly low. "He died when I was a child of 6. I never knew him well, and he spoke, so far as I recall, nothing whatever of the Vanes or of any service he had rendered them. I saw no reason to volunteer a connection that could serve no purpose but to draw suspicion upon myself in a matter with which I have nothing to do." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, and then inclined his head as though the explanation entirely satisfied him. "Thank you, Mr. Wren. That is all I wish to know for the present." We took our leave, and it was not until we had gained the street that I ventured to remark upon what seemed to me a curious want of persistence on Holmes's part. "You accepted his account very readily," I said. "I had expected you to press him further." "I accepted it as an answer, Watson, which is a very different thing from accepting it as the truth," said Holmes, drawing his coat about him against the wind that had risen with the afternoon. "A man who has genuinely forgotten his father speaks of him with the vague indifference of one recalling a stranger. Wren spoke of his father's silence upon the subject of the vines with a particular emphasis of a man who has rehearsed that silence carefully against the day when someone might ask him to account for it." "You believe he lied?" "I believe he told us a story assembled, perhaps years ago, for exactly this contingency," said Holmes, "though whether it is wholly false or only incomplete I cannot yet say." Consider, Watson, what we now possess. A household divided by a fortune, a dead man's doubts about his own nephew's parentage, a missing letter numbered 7 in a sequence otherwise intact, a burned photograph of a young clerk in an old-fashioned collar, and a present-day clerk whose father bore a name that connects him, by the plainest thread, to a scandal 30 years buried. I do not yet see the whole shape of this matter, but I begin, I think, to see its outline, and it is not the outline that Inspector Lestrade has drawn. Chapter 7. The Arrest of Horace Bell. The blow, when it fell swiftly, and with a completeness that seemed for a time to sweep away every doubt that Holmes had so carefully cultivated in my mind. I had gone that morning upon a small errand of my own, and returned to Baker Street to find a note awaiting me, summoning me at once to Bell's lodgings off the Gray's Inn Road, where Holmes had already preceded me at Lestrade's urgent request. I arrived to find the small sitting-room in a state of considerable disorder, 2 constables standing at the door and Lestrade himself presiding over the scene with an air of ill-suppressed triumph. "You're just in time, Doctor," said he as I entered. "We have found enough here to hang the case twice over." Spread upon the table before him lay the fruits of the search, an ageing typewriting machine, its lowercase e sitting, as Holmes had predicted, a fraction above the line, a small paper twist of whole cloves, half emptied, a disc of red sealing wax bearing unmistakably the impression of the probate court seal, and a packet of photographic printing paper, its wrapper torn open and several sheets missing. In a corner of the hearth, half consumed but not quite destroyed, lay a torn scrap of paper upon which I could make out, even at a glance, a fragment of the very words that had been sent to Fairley: "Withdraw Charles Vane." Bell himself stood between the 2 constables, his grey face drained of all colour, protesting in a voice that cracked with the strain of it. "I never wrote that message, Mr. Holmes. I swear it upon my soul. I do not deny the typewriter is mine, nor the cloves. God knows half of London could tell you of my toothache, but I've never possessed a wax seal in my life, still less the court's own die, and that scrap in the grate is none of my burning. Someone has placed these things here to ruin me." "That is easily said, sir," Lestrade replied, not unkindly, but with the settled certainty of a man who has heard such protestations many times before, and found them, upon examination, to want substance. "It is a deal harder to explain away a court seal in your own hearth." Holmes had said little throughout this exchange, standing somewhat apart with his hands clasped behind him, his eyes moving from object to object upon the table, with a deliberation that contrasted strangely with the general excitement of the room. I confess that even I, familiar as I was with his methods, found the accumulated weight of evidence difficult to resist. Here at last was a motive graver, perhaps, than any yet proposed. 20 years of faithful service ended without provision, a master dead intestate through simple carelessness, and a servant left to face old age with nothing but his memories and his grievance to sustain him. What more natural than that such a man, possessed of intimate knowledge of the estate's affairs and ready access, through his years of service to its papers and its habits, should seize upon the confusion following Sir Alister's death to extract by threat what the law had denied him by oversight? "It is persuasive," I murmured to Holmes, as Lestrade began to caution the prisoner in the formal manner required by law. "I do not see how you can gainsay it." "Nor do I, as yet," said Holmes quietly, "which is precisely why I mean to examine it a little further before I permit myself to be persuaded." He stepped forward and took up the disc of sealing wax, turning it beneath the light with the particular care he reserved for objects he suspected of concealing more than they showed. "Inspector," said he, "when your men discovered this seal, in what position did it lie? Face upward, toward the ceiling, or face downward, pressed against the surface upon which it was found?" Lestrade, who had been in the act of directing his constables toward the removal of the prisoner, paused and regarded the question with evident impatience. "Face upward, Mr. Holmes, if it signifies anything at all. It lay upon the shelf yonder, the impression plainly visible the moment we lifted the cloth that covered it." "Thank you," said Holmes, and I saw the faint private smile that touched the corner of his mouth, a smile I had long since learned to associate not with satisfaction at a mystery solved, but with the first clear glimpse of a solution not yet ready to be spoken aloud. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, not without a certain edge to his voice, for he had grown accustomed over the years to Holmes extracting significance from trifles that the official force preferred to leave undisturbed. "You've asked your question. Does it help the prisoner, or does it not?" "I could not say with certainty," Holmes replied, which was, as I well knew, no answer at all, but rather a door deliberately left ajar. "I should like a little time to consider the matter before I commit myself to an opinion that might do Mr. Bell more harm than good, were it proved mistaken." I pressed him further as we walked away from that unhappy scene, Bell having been led off between the constables with a last despairing glance in our direction that I found difficult to forget. "Holmes, you cannot mean to leave the man in custody a moment longer than necessary, if you believe him innocent. What is it about the position of that seal that troubles you so?" "I mean to leave him in custody exactly as long as is necessary, Watson, and not a moment longer," said Holmes, "for his continued detention, uncomfortable as it must be for him, serves at present to keep our true quarry easy in mind, and an easy mind is a careless one. As to the seal, I will tell you this much. A working impression, made in the ordinary course of sealing a document, is pressed downward against the paper it is meant to secure. The wax that Lestrade found lay upward, as though it had been set down to dry after the impression had already been taken elsewhere. Set down, in short, not by a man sealing a letter, but by a man disposing of evidence he had no further use for, and who gave no thought to the manner of its lying because he didn't understand that the manner might speak. Then you believe the evidence was planted?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that we have been shown, for the second time in this case, a solution too conveniently complete to have arrived by accident. And I begin to suspect, Watson, that the hand which arranged it possesses a very exact understanding of what the police expect to find, and precisely how to give it to them." Chapter 8. The One Impossible Detail. The case against Bell, already formidable, was made complete upon the following morning by a discovery that seemed, at the time, to close the matter beyond any further argument. A second search of his lodgings, conducted at Lestrade's insistence with rather more thoroughness than the first, uncovered within the writing desk a hollow compartment, ingeniously fitted beneath a false bottom of the lower drawer, and within that compartment, folded exactly as such documents are customarily folded, lay the missing grant of administration itself. I met Holmes at Fairley's chambers that afternoon, whither the recovered document had been brought for the solicitor's formal identification, and found the little room crowded with a self-congratulation that sat uneasily upon me, though I could not at that hour have said precisely why. "There, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, laying the paper upon the desk with something of a flourish. "I think we may call the matter closed. Motive, opportunity, and now the article itself found hidden in the very room where the man sleeps. I do not see what more any court could ask." Fairley, for his part, was profuse in his gratitude, shaking Holmes warmly by the hand and declaring that the affair could never have been brought to so swift a conclusion without his assistance, a courtesy that struck me even then as somewhat generously extended since Holmes had contributed, so far as the visible facts of the arrest went, remarkably little to its accomplishment. I said as much to him, in an undertone, as the others busied themselves with the formalities of the recovery. "I see no reasonable alternative myself," I admitted. "The document is found, Holmes. What further doubt can remain?" "None, perhaps, if the document before us is indeed the one that was stolen," said Holmes, and something in his tone caused Fairley to look up sharply. "You will permit me a moment's examination, Mr. Fairley, before the matter is pronounced finally settled." He drew the grant toward him and laid beside it, for comparison, several other documents from Fairley's files bearing the same court seal, examining each beneath his lens with a patience that gradually stilled the chatter in the room. "The seal is genuine, so far as I can determine," said he at length, "or at the least, a reproduction of such fidelity that I cannot presently distinguish it from the true impression. The paper is of the correct stock, the wording precisely as it should stand." He paused and turned the document toward the light, tilting it at a low angle across its surface. "But here, in the lower corner, is a matter that requires explanation." We crowded closer, and I could make out, when the light fell properly upon it, a faint rectangular depression pressed into the paper's fibre, scarcely visible unless the sheet were held so as to catch a raking light. "A pressure mark," said Holmes, "of the precise dimensions one would expect from the metal plate of a copying press. The very press, Mr. Fairley, which Wren assured me has stood unused these 5 years past." Fairley's face had grown pale. "You are suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing as yet. I am observing a fact, and I invite you to observe it with me. This document has at some point passed beneath the plate of that disused press. A genuine grant of administration, issued by the probate court and delivered directly into your keeping, would have no occasion whatever to acquire such a mark. A copy, made for the purpose of deception, might very easily acquire one, if the press employed to reproduce it were not perfectly cleared of its former fittings." "But Mr. Holmes," Lestrade broke in, though with rather less confidence than he had shown a moment before, "even granting your press mark, this is surely the original grant itself recovered from Bell's own desk. Are you telling us the man kept a copy rather than the article he stole?" "I am telling you a good deal more than that, Inspector, though I confess I have not yet told it to myself with entire certainty." Holmes drew from his notebook a page of careful pencil sketches, which I recognised upon a glance as the record he had made 3 days before of the interior of Fairley's steel cabinet. "When first I examined that cabinet, before ever the theft was more than an hour or 2 old, I noted the pattern of dust and disturbance within it, and I made, from mere habit, a sketch of the creases visible in the green baize lining, where a folded document had evidently rested for some time. The folds indicated by that impression run differently, Watson, here and here, from the folds now present in the paper before us. This grant has been folded upon a different line from the one that lay in Fairley's cabinet before it vanished. The silence that followed this pronouncement was, I think, the most complete I had yet witnessed in the course of our investigation. Even Lestrade, who was not by temperament given to easy conviction, stood staring at the document as though it might, under sufficient scrutiny, confess its own imposture. "Then this is not the stolen grant at all," said Fairley, in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "It is a very skilful duplicate," said Holmes, "produced, I should judge, upon the very press that Mr. Wren assured me stood idle, and placed within Mr. Bell's desk by a hand that understood precisely what discovery would satisfy the police, and precisely where such a discovery ought to be made in order to seem neither too easy nor too difficult to find. Consider also, Inspector, the seal you showed me yesterday, lying face upward as though set down to dry rather than pressed in the ordinary way against paper. A man planting evidence he has not himself made by the usual process would very naturally lay it down without troubling over which face should show, for he knows already that no genuine sealing was ever performed in that room." "Then someone has gone to extraordinary lengths," I said, "not merely to steal the document, but to manufacture its return in a form calculated to convict an innocent man." "Extraordinary lengths indeed," said Holmes gravely, "and lengths that argue a mind of very considerable resource, very considerable patience, and a knowledge of this office and of police method so intimate that I confess myself unable any longer to look for its owner among the occasional visitors to these chambers. We must look, Watson, a good deal closer to home than that." Chapter 9. Holmes sets the papers in order. Holmes summoned the whole company to Fairley's chambers upon the following evening, a gathering that included, besides the solicitor himself, Charles and Eleanor Vane, Mrs. Crowther and Bell, released now upon Holmes's private assurance to Lestrade that the charge against him would not survive the week. Thomas Wren attended also at Fairley's request to assist, as he supposed, in some final ordering of the office papers. Lestrade stood near the door, his expression compounded of curiosity and a certain wary readiness, for whatever correction his methods were about to receive. Holmes stood beside the desk where, 3 days before, we had first examined the empty cabinet and began, as was his custom upon such occasions, not with the name of the guilty party, but with the error that had obscured it. "We have proceeded from the very outset of this inquiry," said he, "upon an assumption so natural that none of us thought to question it, that the grant of administration was itself the object of the theft, that whoever took it desired either to sell it back at a price or to delay by its absence the settlement of the estate for some private advantage. That assumption was mistaken. The grant was never the true object at all. It was the means by which a very different object was to be obtained." "Then what was the true object, Mr. Holmes?" asked Fairley, glancing uneasily about the room. "A single missing letter, Mr. Fairley, numbered 7 in a sequence otherwise complete, which I found disturbed in a locked drawer at Vane House, and which required for its safe removal that every eye in this affair be fixed upon the missing grant, and upon poor Mr. Bell, rather than upon a quiet visit to a certain study in Bloomsbury." Holmes turned, and his gaze came to rest, gently but without wavering, upon the mild countenance of Thomas Wren. "The thief, ladies and gentlemen, is the one person among us who appeared to possess nothing whatever worth concealing." Wren did not start, nor cry out, nor make any of the gestures that guilt is commonly supposed to produce. He only grew very still, as a man grows still who has long expected a blow, and finds, when it falls at last, that expectation has already spent the worst of its pain. "You will recall," Holmes continued, addressing the room at large, "that Sir Alister in his final months set inquiries afoot concerning a man named Arthur Wren, once a junior clerk in the household of Richard Vane, who vanished some 30 years ago, about the time of Charles Vane's birth. Arthur Wren was this man's father. I had at first supposed, as I think we all supposed, that Arthur Wren's connection with the family pointed towards some irregularity in Charles's own parentage, that he might in short have been Charles's true father, and Thomas therefore possessed of a claim, however indirect, upon the Vane fortune. "That was never my belief," said Wren suddenly, his voice low but steady. "I never sought a farthing of their money, Mr. Holmes. You must believe that much, whatever else you charge me with." "I do believe it," said Holmes, "for the truth, when I came at last to it, proved a good deal more painful than any claim upon an inheritance, and considerably less to your material advantage. Arthur Wren was not Charles Vane's father. He was, however, party to a very much older concealment, one reaching back not 1 generation, but 2. Richard Vane himself, gentlemen, the father of Charles and the brother of Sir Alister, was born outside the bounds of his own parents' marriage, a fact known to very few, and buried, so far as the world was concerned, for the better part of half a century. Arthur Wren, as a young clerk trusted with the family's private papers, was paid to help ensure that burial remained undisturbed. A murmur ran round the room, and I saw Charles Vane's face, in particular, undergo a swift succession of changes, astonishment, calculation, and something that might almost have been relief. Sir Alister, in these last months of his life, uncovered the truth of it, Holmes went on, and resolved, whether from a scrupulous conscience or some old grievance of his own, to make it known before he died. He can have had little notion, I think, of the injury such a disclosure must do to a man 3 decades dead, and to a son who had no part whatever in his father's concealed birth. But Thomas Wren knew what such a disclosure would mean for his own father's memory, that Arthur Wren's name, forgotten by all the world besides, would be dragged into the light and fixed forever to a charge of fraud and connivance in a deception of the gravest consequence to an ancient family. It was not money that moved him, gentlemen, but the same instinct that moves us all when the dead we loved are threatened with a dishonour they cannot answer for themselves. I could not let it stand, said Wren, and here at last his composure broke, though quietly, without violence. My father was a good man, Mr. Holmes, whatever use was made of him in his youth. He raised me on nothing but honest work after they cast him off. I could not see his name given to the newspapers as a conspirator in some scandal of the Vane's own making. "And so," Holmes resumed, gently but without softening the substance of his account, "you contrived a scheme of very considerable ingenuity. You took a graphite impression of the cabinet lock while the key lay, as it always did, within easy reach of your own desk, and from that impression filed a duplicate. You used the old copying press, which you had told me, with perfect truthfulness so far as its recent history was concerned, stood unused for years, though you yourself had lately restored it to a single evening service, to produce a photographic reproduction of the grant before removing the original from the cabinet. You visited Mr. Bell's lodgings under some pretext, and while there typed your anonymous message upon his machine, leaving behind, unnoticed, the fragments of evidence that would later damn him. Clothes taken, I do not doubt, from his own paper upon the mantel, and a scrap of your message dropped, as though by accident, into his grate. The damp mark upon the carpet, I put in, unable to restrain myself, and the paper knife, turned the wrong way about. Were both explained the moment I understood the rest, said Holmes. The carpet was dampened by Wren's own umbrella, brought into the records room before the evening's rain had properly begun, which told me he had entered that room earlier in the afternoon than his own carefully rehearsed timetable allowed. The paper knife had been shifted to make room for the desk drawer to stand open longer than a moment's business required, while he took his impression of the cabinet key undisturbed, and his memory, gentlemen, his flawless, unhesitating memory of that afternoon's comings and goings, was flawless because it had been rehearsed, prepared in advance against the very inquiry he knew must follow, for the whole scheme depended upon a timetable he alone could vouch for. He paused, and drew from his breast pocket a folded paper, worn at its edges, which he laid upon the desk before Fairley. Sir Alister's memorandum, Mr. Fairley, recovered this afternoon from the lining of Mr. Wren's document case, where it had lain hidden since the night it was taken from the drawer in Bloomsbury. I believe upon this evidence that Mr. Wren will have little further reason to deny what I have laid before you. Wren did not deny it. He bowed his head, and in a voice grown very quiet said only, "I would do it again, Mr. Holmes, though I know it was wrong. A man may forgive the law a great deal sooner than he can forgive himself for standing by while his father's name is broken for the amusement of strangers." Chapter 10. The Weight of a Name. The original grant of administration was recovered within 2 days, from a sealed tin box discovered beneath a loose board in Wren's own lodgings, folded exactly as it had lain in Fairley's cabinet before ever it was disturbed, and bearing, when Holmes examined it, precisely the creases his sketch had led him to expect. Fairley presented it at the bank without further hindrance, and the estate of Sir Alister Vane passed at last into the ordinary and unremarkable course of administration that the law had always intended for it. Bell was released without a stain upon his character, and I was glad to learn, some weeks later, that Charles Vane, whatever his other failings, had thought it only just to secure for the old secretary a small pension out of the estate's revenues, in recognition of 20 years' honest service that Sir Alister's carelessness in the matter of a will had so nearly left unrewarded. Bell called once at Baker Street to offer his thanks, and I remember him standing rather awkwardly in our sitting-room, turning his hat in his hands and saying that he had never doubted Mr. Holmes would see the truth of it, though he confessed he had doubted once or twice in the small hours of his confinement whether the truth would be found in time. Thomas Wren was arrested and charged with theft, forgery, and obstruction of justice, and I will not pretend that the law looked upon his offences with any great tenderness, for the machinery he had set in motion had come within a hair's breadth of destroying an innocent man's liberty and reputation alike. Yet Fairley, to his very great credit, went before the court himself and spoke at length of Wren's 12 years of blameless service, of the entire absence of any financial motive in the whole affair, and of the singular loyalty, misguided but not, I think, ignoble, that had driven a quiet, ordinary clerk to so extraordinary a deception. Whether these words materially softened the sentence that followed, I cannot say with certainty, though I have always believed they did. The larger secret, touching as it did upon matters far more delicate than the theft of a single document, was handled with a discretion that did credit to all concerned. Holmes having satisfied himself of the essential facts, took the pains to establish, through inquiries I will not weary the reader by rehearsing, that the irregularity in Richard Vane's own birth, whatever its truth, lay too far back in time and had been too long acquiesced in by every party with an interest in disputing it, to disturb in any way Charles Vane's present and lawful position as his father's son and his uncle's heir. The scandal, in short, was permitted to remain what it had so long been, a private grief rather than a public spectacle. Charles himself, I am glad to record, emerged from the affair a somewhat chastened man. He called upon Fairley within the week to propose that the management of the estate be shared jointly with his cousin Eleanor, rather than exercised by himself alone, a concession that surprised no one so much as Eleanor, who had gone to Bedford Row prepared, I believe, for a renewal of hostilities rather than an offer of partnership. Whatever else may be said of Charles Vane's character, I think it fair to record that a narrow escape from ruin had taught him, if only for a season, the value of a fortune honestly shared over one jealously guarded. Mrs. Crowther, for her part, made no further attempt to shield the household's older secrets behind a wall of silence. She destroyed no papers, as I understand she might once have been tempted to do, but placed what remained of Sir Alister's private correspondence into Fairley's keeping, to be dealt with as the law and the family's dignity together required. I saw her once more, some months afterward, in the course of another matter entirely, and thought her bearing, though still touched by melancholy, considerably less burdened than it had been on the evening of our first visit to Bloomsbury. It was on a quiet evening some weeks after the case had been formally closed that I found occasion, over our pipes before the fire at Baker Street, to ask Holmes the question that had lingered in my mind since the very first hour of Wren's unmasking. What was it, Holmes, that first turned your suspicion toward him? I confess that of all the persons in this affair, he seemed to me the very last upon whom guilt might reasonably fall. Holmes considered the question for a while in silence, his eyes upon the fire, before he answered. It was not the graphite, Watson, though that told me a duplicate key had been made. It was not the wax, nor the copying press, nor even his curious inability to recite the afternoon's events backward, though each of these, in its turn, narrowed my field of suspicion very considerably. It was, in the end, a simpler thing than any of these. His helpfulness. His helpfulness? Consider the company we examined, Watson. Charles Vane had his debts to conceal, and concealed them poorly. Eleanor Vane had her ambitions for the estate, which she scarcely troubled to disguise. Bell had his old grievance and his old loyalty, each pulling him towards silence upon certain points. Mrs. Crowther had her 30-year-old secret, guarded with a wariness that betrayed its weight at every turn. Every soul in this drama, in short, was seen by us to be concealing something, and each concealment, however small, left its mark upon their manner, precisely as a stone dropped into still water leaves its ring upon the surface. Wren alone showed us no such ring. He was eager, open, endlessly forthcoming, a very model of the helpful witness. And it was that very perfection which troubled me, for I have observed, Watson, over a good many years of this curious trade, that a case built entirely upon secrets rarely contains, among its principal actors, even one person with nothing whatever to hide. The absence, in Wren's case, was as unnatural as any presence could have been, and it was that unnaturalness, more than any single fact, which first set me watching him. He knocked out his pipe against the grate, and for a while neither of us spoke, the fire settling quietly upon the hearth, as the fog gathered once more beyond our windows. I have thought a good deal, in the time since, upon that last observation of his, and I have come to believe it touches something larger than the particular case that gave it birth. For it seems to me now, looking back over the whole curious history of that stolen grant, that the reasoning power my friend possesses in so extraordinary a degree does not merely uncover what is hidden, as the world commonly supposes, but reaches further still, for at its finest it lays bare not only the fact concealed, but the very reason a man came to believe that the truth, whatever the cost of guarding it, had to remain hidden at all.